My name is Keith Lamar. I'm a death row prisoner at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, Ohio. In 1995, I was sentenced to death for a crime I did not commit. According to the state, I was said to have participated in the deaths of 5 inmates who were suspected of being informants. When I refused to become an informant myself and refused the state's offer of a plea bargain, I was prosecuted and prevented from presenting evidence of my innocence, even a statement from an actual perpetrator who admitted to killing someone for whom I was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death. I'm innocent. I didn't kill anyone during the uprising, and the state knew this. And they knew it because multiple witnesses came forward and pointed the finger at someone else. But because I was vocal in my criticisms of them and the way in which we were treated before and after the uprising, they decided to make an example out of me. And now they intend to kill me, strap me down to a cold gurney, and pump poison through my veins. I intend to stop them. Indeed, inasmuch as my life is not for them to take, I intend to fight them. And if after you view this documentary, you believe in my plight, I hope you will join me in this fight. Not just to undo what was done to me, but to undo the injustice of a system that is too often used as a weapon against the poor, against nameless, faceless individuals whose story we would never know or hear. Let's fight them together. Justice is not a privilege, it's a right. People are being killed who could be saved.
I came to Lucasville in 1990s, so I was there a couple of years before the Lucasville uprising took place, and the conditions there was bad and getting worse. That's pretty much why they used to transfer people down there to be subjected to those environments. And when the new warden came in after the murder of a school teacher, Beverly Taylor, he started instituting, even stricter rules and regulations. Was made it rougher, as far as people doing time, as well as, for the guards. And it was creating a lot of tension. Arthur Tate, the new warden, he developed a system to create snitches where you could drop a kite in, 411, and then go to him. And this was creating a lot of tension, even amongst the guards. The racial tension was there. You had guards, who were parts of the Aryan Brotherhood as well as KKK and wore tattoos on them, and they was there, and they was, allowing a lot of stuff to go on, that shouldn't have been able to go on, and assisting in a lot of the killings and a lot of the assaults that was taking place in the institution, There was a killing of a guy down in the gym during an officer and inmate basketball game. And and after they killed him, they tried to call all the officers that was in the gym at the time to testify. None of them would even testify. That was the environment in Lucasville, pretty much. The guards was pulling people out of their cells and jumping on them. There's a lot of this stuff.
I've been able to speak with both guards and inmates, two groups that most people think have very different opinions on things. But what I found is that there's a common understanding of what happened, and there's also individuals and a state apparatus that they blame for it. This includes a warden who antagonized the relationship between guards and inmates, and this also includes a state that allowed an institution like Lucasville to develop as it did. Well, I think when we try to understand how blame was placed for what happened during the Lucasville prison uprising, I think it's useful to look at other institutions and how we would assess blame there. So for example, if a deadly fire broke out in a hospital that was overcrowded and did not meet certain safety regulations, and that hospital was run by the state, we hold the state liable for what happened during that fire, for not following certain safety regulations and for creating an atmosphere that was dangerous. What happened at Lucasville is that our patients were blamed, but not the state. And in the case of Keith Lamar, imagine being a patient in a hospital where this fire has broke out, and you're in a room where you're not sure whether or not you're going to be burned to death. Once you get through that situation, you now find yourself charged for being responsible for this outbreak of the fire when you had nothing to do with that. The way that the state reacted to the Lucasville prison uprising was to shuffle all blame to individuals that were forced into this context, including individuals that had nothing to do with creating the context or any of the actions during that context.
It's been well established that Keith Lamar's constitutional rights to due process were violated when his Brady rights were denied.
Brady versus Maryland is a case that the United States Supreme Court decided in 1963. And what that case says is that the prosecution has a duty to turn over exculpatory information, that is, information that helps the defense, either on the issue of guilt or on the issue of punishment. And if the prosecution fails to turn over exculpatory information to the defense, that violates due process. What due process means is fairness. It's unfair to deny someone the opportunity to know information that the prosecution knows that helps the defense. Under Brady, the duty to turn over exculpatory information applies not only to the prosecutor, but also to anybody within the prosecutor's control, and that is the police, crime labs, other types of investigators, individuals and offices that fall up under the prosecutor or have a relationship with the prosecutor where the prosecutor basically controls the information. The prosecutor has a duty to seek and get from the police information that may be helpful to the defense. The prosecutor is not allowed to say, well, I didn't know that this information existed in the file. Once a Brady request is made, they have the obligation to go and search for the information. It could be helpful to the defense. Discovery is the process by which the defense learns about the prosecutor's case.
Discovery is probably the most important issue in Keith's trial. It has to do with the production of information that the state has in its possession that the defense may need in order to defend the person who's being accused. Discovery takes place before trial. In Keith's case, I think that is where the case really went off the rails. In Ohio, a death penalty case goes first through state courts. When the jury says that they think the person is guilty, whatever facts were heard by the jury are then taken as that's it. From then on, you're having to disprove what led to the decision to convict and to sentence to death. The procedure in federal court in a case like this is called habeas corpus. But what they're basically doing is to say, is anything that was done in the state court a violation of the Constitution? Not just did it violate state law, but in the way this thing was handled, were there constitutional violations? So that's where, again, this Brady issue of discovery comes up again, because that's a federal constitutional issue.
What happened in Keith Lamar's case? Keith and his attorney appeared before a trial jury in Lawrence County. The case was moved from Scioto County, where the Lucasville prison is located, to Lawrence County, and this idea of moving the venue of a trial is supposed to give the defendant a fair, unbiased hearing. The only problem is that Lawrence County is a long spit from Scioto County, and the demography is almost identical, and there were two black people in the prospective jurors called for Keith who were both thrown out. He had an all-white jury in southern Ohio. Now, his trial attorneys asked for discovery. The prosecution could have provided discovery in one of two forms. The best would have been simply to turn over the transcripts of all conversations initiated by the prosecution with a potential witness. The prosecution showed up at Keith's trial with these data entries, not the transcripts, with these data entries in hand, and they gave them to the judge. And they said, in effect, Your Honor, we can't decide what to give this defendant, you decide. The judge told the prosecutor, just give the defense counsel a list of names of persons you interviewed. And 24 hours later, a list of 43 names was transmitted. That list omitted some of the most critical persons interviewed by the prosecution who were later called at trial. Stacey Gordon, Lewis Jones. Imagine yourself a defense attorney with a list of 43 names. The trial is going to begin in 6 weeks. What are you supposed to do? How do you know how to proceed? You need to know, at least have a summary of what each of those individuals said before you can make a decision. Well, we'll prioritize these 17 interviews and get to the rest if we have time. They couldn't do that. Not only that, when they showed up at a certain prison and said they wanted to interview a particular potential witness, the witnesses, and I'm talking about people who later testified at Keith's trial, the witnesses often simply refused, leaving Keith's attorneys with the option of subpoenaing that man into court without a clue as to what he might say. In other words, this was compliance, alleged compliance with defense counsel's requests for discovery, which was, to my knowledge, completely outside any precedent in any court anywhere in the United States. It was a farce.
What stays with me most vividly about Keith's trial was the overall unfairness of the trial that resulted from the denial of access to evidence, particularly exculpatory evidence in terms of information that would have either directly impeached the state's witnesses against him or would have been exculpatory by showing that Keith was not present in L Block at the time they claimed he was and the killings occurred, or done both of those things. It was clear that many of the state witnesses, to one degree or another, had made up a story to fit the investigation theory. We were given information that contradicted their versions. We had no idea who said it. They gave us a list of witnesses who might have said it, but it's a big difference when you go to a person and say, I know you said this, versus walking in and say, okay, I've got 16 names and one guy said this, was it you? They're going to say, no, get out of here. So it's, just a totally unbalanced situation. I have heard references that Mr. Pete Meyer, or one of the witnesses for the state at the federal district habeas hearing, did try to justify the way they approached providing discovery by saying that they gave Brady a narrow interpretation. I think that anybody with a grasp of the constitutional concepts of Brady and the cases that follow it know that there is no such thing as a narrow interpretation. It says what it says, and to put that in a nutshell, that is, you're to give the defense anything that's favorable. You're to ask the cops, all the investigators, because what they have is imputed to you, and there's no way to narrowly interpret that. It says what it says, and they did not. I guess the polite thing I can say is that's a nice excuse, but it doesn't fly.
As an example of information known to the prosecution that should have been turned over to counsel for defendant Lamar, Stacey Gordon was one of two key witnesses against Lamar. In fact, I think Stacey Gordon was probably the individual who actually coordinated the death squad. But setting that aside, less than a year before Keith's trial, the prosecution, which had indicted Mr. Gordon for a surprising number of violent actions during the 11 days, dropped the more serious of those charges and entered into a plea agreement. And at that particular time and place, the prosecutor elected to ask Mr. Gordon a few additional questions and have them transcribed by a court reporter. The prosecutor asked Mr. Gordon on that occasion, "Do you know Keith Lamar?" Answer, "No." Question, "Did you see Keith Lamar in the L6 block in the early hours of the riot at Lucasville?" No. Now this is the man who less than a year later appeared as a prosecution witness at trial and said, "Yeah, I saw the whole thing from the upper tier. Mr. Lamar was the captain of the death squad. He took them from cell to cell as they killed the decedents." This man was probably the most significant prosecution witness. He lied through his teeth. Had the defense had that little plea agreement, they could have done wonders with it. There would have been both exculpatory and impeaching evidence concerning Mr. Gordon had the prosecution done what Brady demands. So this was a caricature, a travesty, an obscenity. I lack words to describe what an insult, not just to the defendant and defendant's counsel. This is not what Brady versus Maryland intended.
Suppressed evidence in his own testimony actually point to Stacey Gordon as the leader of the death squad. Keith Lamar was out on the rec yard when all the killings took place. He had no gang affiliation and no involvement in the killings that took place inside of L Block. And in the end, Stacey Gordon was used by Special Prosecutor Mark Piepmeyer to give false testimony against Keith Lamar. And ultimately, what he got in exchange for his testimony was an early parole in 2007. Stacey Gordon wasn't the only person who colluded with the prosecution. Another inmate named Lewis Jones admitted that he had been part of the death squad that killed other inmates, and he got off scot-free in exchange for his testimony against Keith. Early after the uprising came to an end, another inmate named Aaron Jefferson came forward to the investigators and said he had something to share with them. In one of their recorded interviews, he admitted in detail how he had single-handedly conducted the murder against another inmate. This inmate is someone who Keith Lamar faces execution for, and the reason is that the prosecution completely disregarded his confession of murder and hid it from Keith's defense. Another problem with the prosecution's case against Keith Lamar was that they hid other exculpatory evidence, including an indictment against a man named Frederick Frakes, who had been accused and evidence had been provided that he had committed a murder. Yet that indictment mysteriously disappeared when they decided to go after Keith Lamar for that same murder.
So why was Keith Lamar railroaded into a death penalty case? After all, he was not involved in organizing the uprising. He did not take part in the uprising. He was on the recreation yard when the killings inside L Block took place. Keith and the other 300 prisoners who were on the rec yard were taken into custody by the police very, very early on in the uprising, and Keith spent the remainder of the 11-day siege locked in another part of the prison. So why was he targeted, charged with killing 5 prisoners and sentenced to death? Some say Keith stood out after the uprising when he refused to cooperate with the prosecution. Not only did he refused to testify for the state or even submit to being interrogated, but he encouraged other prisoners to do the same. He told prisoners, don't become snitches, don't even talk to the state. And some say, for that reason, he put a target on his back.
Well, one thing I noticed about Keith Lamar that we've talked about many times is that he feels that he really found himself in prison. I mean, he has had a very hard time, as you can imagine, being in solitary confinement for many, many years. But at the same time, it's a place where he's looked in deeply into himself and he's found kind of who Keith Lamar really is. And one of the main things about that is that he has to be very true to himself. I mean, that was why he didn't give state's testimony, snitch testimony, and tell a lie in order to save his life, was that he felt he had to be true to himself. And I think all of the talks that we've ever had over the years, the one thing that really informs the kinds of things that he says and the way that he lives his life is that he has to be true to himself at all times. Even if it's going to hurt him, even if he thinks there might be some kind of public reaction or it might harm friends or something like that, he still has to tell the truth, because that's the thing which is very, very deeply held within him. And that's why he's facing execution.
In the aftermath of the uprising, there was what could be described as almost like a bloodlust for retribution in the community. In the sparsely populated area surrounding the prison, 26,000 people signed petitions demanding the death penalty and quick executions for those convicted of charges related to the uprising. Some of the people who signed these petitions ended up on the array of the grand jury that indicted Keith Lamar and the other 4 men who were sentenced to death. Picketers outside the prison were yelling for quick justice, just execute them and get it over with. It's difficult for us to think that Prosecutor Pete Meyer and his team would deliberately set out to railroad Keith Lamar using perjured testimony from prisoners, some of whom had committed the murders that Keith was being charged for. But Prosecutor Pete Meyer is no stranger to misconduct. He has been rebuked by the Ohio Supreme Court for prosecutorial misconduct in at least 14 other death penalty cases. Prosecutor Pete Meyer has been involved in other cases where exculpatory evidence was hidden from innocent defendants. In a case very similar to Keith Lamar's, Derek Jamison was sentenced to death and spent 20 years in prison for a murder he had nothing to do with, because Prosecutor Pete Meyer allowed evidence that would have cleared Derek Jamison to be hidden from Derek, from his lawyers, from the court and the jury.
In 1985, I was 24 years old when Judge Thomas Crush in Hamilton County sentenced me to die in Ohio's electric chair for somebody to do. And the last thing I remember when the judge sent me to die was I turned to the victim's parent. His mom was in the courtroom, and the courtroom was packed with my family members and his family members. And I told him, like, Miss Mitchell, I hope y'all can find out who did this to your son, because I am not the man that did this. You know, I'm sorry for what happened to your son, but I am not the guy. Y'all got the wrong guy. They withheld 35 pieces of evidence in my case, and they were talking about killing me too. You know, I could have been murdered. I had 6 days of executions in the state of Ohio. The prosecutor, everything leads back to the prosecutor, because he's the main person that handles the case, you know. And so, I don't know why they would do something of that nature, but what needs to be said about Keith, he shouldn't be on death row. Keith Lamar, you know. He needs to be released from death row and be released from prison. And I've been speaking out against the death penalty, because, you know, this is a human rights violation. I didn't want 53 of my friends that I was on death row with get taken out of their cells and murdered by the state, you know. Can you imagine the guards, they gotta go through this execution that day, then they gotta go home at night and kiss their kids, put their babies to bed. Can you imagine that? You're responsible for the murder of a human being, and you don't even know if you done made a mistake, you know, because, you know, you just following the state. Because they done made so many mistakes. They done made 144 mistakes in the United States. That's 144 reasons we shouldn't have no death penalty. That means 144 people been kidnapped and almost murdered for something they didn't do, you know? People need to know, and a lot of people don't know. That's why a lot of people ain't helping Keith and people like me, because they didn't know.
In the case of Keith Lamar, I'm especially concerned that the prosecuting attorney was Mark Piepmeyer, who has a record of misconduct, which goes to inflammatory statements to the jury, as well as to the withholding of exculpatory evidence, so that we have reason to be suspicious about the results in cases where he is involved, given the repeated decisions by the Ohio Supreme Court involving cases that he has prosecuted. The state should not engage in premeditated murder in taking the life of another, given the fallibility of human beings to manage a criminal justice system fairly, one that is not racially biased. There are obvious economic disparities. Those who can afford a good lawyer don't get executed. those who commit a crime in a jurisdiction where the prosecutor doesn't seek the death penalty are not put on death row. Racial minorities, the poor, the mentally ill, all of these are being subjected to capital punishment out of all proportion to the rate of murders that are committed. We have evidence of 6 exonerations in the state of Ohio, and as of July 2014, 144 throughout the United States, based on the Innocence Project. Unfortunately, the Innocence Project has too few resources to investigate all of the cases that are brought before it. The United States is among only a handful of countries that continues to use capital punishment. Just as our country was one of the last to abolish slavery, we may well be among the last to abolish capital punishment.
Keith and I, we've been friends since high school, actually. We met initially in 10th grade. We were on the basketball team together, and we just became really fast friends. And somehow we grew up incredibly different, but I would have to say that I would have to describe Keith as my best friend. You know, if the state moves forward with this, with what they're planning to do, you know, I think the world will have lost a great talent and a great voice that never had an opportunity to show his full capabilities. Keith Lamar, he's not a number. You know, he has a name, he has a spirit. He's a person that has a capability to add value to society. There's been so many cases that have come out recently, especially with the Innocence Project, and you know, I've seen segments on 60 Minutes and other documentaries on some of the practices in terms of prosecutors' offices or lack of appropriate DNA evidence that have, and people have been exonerated that have been waiting to be executed on death row. And I just think that it's unfortunate that in this particular situation, with all of the evidence that's there, that there seems to be a lack of will. And I think it's political. I honestly think that it's political.
I appreciate Keith as a friend for many reasons. The uniqueness of his personality, his strength, and the way that he has maintained a steadfast belief that the system will finally work for him and he will be set free. Keith and I have remained in contact. As you said, it's 19 years last month was the trial. I think that he and I formed a rather unique bond based in large part on the differences in our life, the differences in our background. Keith is probably one of the most intellectually and spiritually sincere and strong people that I've ever met.
I mean, you have to understand that in the period after the Lucasville uprising, the state had more or less launched a campaign to get prisoners to snitch against other prisoners, to tell lies. And in fact, they knew who did most of the serious killings that were committed in the prison and some of the other things that happened there. And they were trying to get people who did do those things to implicate other people. Keith refused to snitch. He refused to play that game because he knows he's innocent. And even though he knew that this could put him on death row, this could be something that would endanger his life, he simply refused to tell a lie. This is something that's very deeply held within him, is that you don't do that. So he refused to play that game that was put forward by the state of snitching in order to save yourself and then putting someone else in the line. The prosecution system in Lucasville is something that we see probably throughout the U.S. justice system, that prisoners have a choice. Either they lie to save themselves, or they tell the truth and they put themselves in danger. Okay. We're brought up by our parents and by other people, people who respect in society, that truth is really the objective of our lives. We should live our lives according to what we see as being true. So do we really want to live in a society where we're taught that you actually get ahead in principle if you tell a lie, and if you tell the truth, you can wind up on death row. You can wind up facing execution for doing that.
That all is originating from an Ohio correctional institution and may be recorded or monitored.
But I am here to tell you that there's two separate systems. One for those with money and a very different one for the poor. There's no rich people on death row. But I learned about the system the hard way. I had a guy that testified on me in my case. They was asking him about what he saw, and he said, if you want to see it, contact Langley, Washington, D.C. There's a mic, because the FBI had implanted a microscopic microchip in his brain, and it's all on video, it's all recorded. I'm on death row based on that type of testimony. But I just want you all to have a sense of what's being done in your name. See, there's no physical evidence, there's no forensic evidence, no DNA linked to any of the crimes. That's a fact. It's also a fact that just as many people who testified on me, it was just as many people saying somebody else did it. That's a fact. But the jury in my case never got to hear those facts because the prosecutor is still doing his job. He heard those facts from me. I was there, though. I know I didn't kill anybody. So I'm telling you with 100% certainty I'm innocent, but I know you can't take my word for it, and I'm not asking you to. But I'm asking you not to let them kill me on the testimony. So they got microscopic microchips in their brain. We got all these theories about how the system's supposed to work. And it's this real good line that you hear all the time, that the prosecutor's job is not to win guilty verdicts, but to see that justice is done. And if you have money, that's the kind of shit that applies. So I understand why they did what they did, and it was lucrative. They got paid a lot of money.
60 seconds left on this call.
But this 20 years now, you done paid off your mortgage. You done sent your kids to college, man. Enough is enough, man. 20 years, enough.
I just want him to come home. I would love that most of all, is freedom. I pray every night that my nephew, Keith Lamar, will not be put to death, but placed on freedom. Every night of my life, I'm on my knees praying that one day I get that phone call and he'll say, T, I'm out, come and get me. That would be my most happiest, rejoiceful day in this lifetime if I ever got that phone call. Yes. I just want them to be fair to people that made mistakes. We all make mistakes, but just rectify your mistake and let my nephew come home. I will pray for you to do the right thing. He deserves a life, and he has something to give back to the children that are out here now that are struggling to find themselves. And I know God has something for him to do besides being incarcerated. Yes, yes.
We got 99 problems. Why revolutions ain't one? And revolutions ain't won with passive-aggressive slave mentalities that would rather kill the soul than the body. Ain't nobody handing out subsidies for freedom, so lucky for y'all, I'll pay with my life. Matter of fact, tell them to hang my corpse so high that the next generation sees stars of my courage. In the sky I live like I got black gods and goddesses on my side with Nat Turner and Marcus Garvey in these bloodlines. Who's to blame for our neighborhood's demise if we refuse to get up and fight? We move faster. But Jay-Z 16 bars when 16 of our own brothers are encaged behind 16 bars. Mass incarceration is just the reincarnation of chattel slavery, but we the new slaves, and new slaves love new chains and pushing new whips that leave tread marks on the membrane. It's a shame how good and how bad it feels to be a nigga. And this country got so many ills, but it's illegal for a nigga to feel. And this country, so we don't shed tears when bright futures get imitated. And this country, how much of our blood needs to spill in this country? So I'm looking for soldiers, cause ain't no middle ground on this war field in this country. And I know you're looking at me wondering like how I still got dreams, like how my aspirations ain't vanished into thin air with the dope you unveiled in my neighborhoods. But I want you to hear me, and hear me clearly when I say yes, I'm still dreaming. And even as I watch former kings and queens dance on my corner for green, while street entrepreneurs slang them things to thrive in your diabolical trickle-down system, we're insane for survival. My pulse pumps prosperity, peace, war, and revolution. You are now watching the evolution of a supreme being, a queen, hailing from the crevices, cricks, and crevices of ancient Kemetic hieroglyphics, an ordained orator. And my words are expensive. If you're lucky, I may let you bid on my memories. If you're lucky, I may place a piece of mind on sale. No wonder I've always been a lover of language. This body of mine, ever so gently meandering through melodic rhythms of diction that humdrum on the spirits of the restless, a heretic for the easily forgettable, with poetic prophecies that lie in the build-up of phonetics. If you were looking for me, my writing has always been on the wall.
What makes Condemned so relevant is that it indicts all of us, conscious and unconscious, by opening our eyes to the conditions and realities of the human frontline that is prison. Keith Lamar exposes the truth about our present times and our overall direction as a society.